Chapter 3, The Purple Cloud. Franklin walked into his reasonably large brick house in his reasonably quiet neighborhood, wishing it weren't his wife's day off. Lyra met him at the door in a rather provocative black dress that accentuated her slender, young-looking body. Lyra looked like a 25-year-old dancer with her slender legs and long red hair, but her actual profession was linguist. She knew several interdimensional languages, loved to translate them, and she always insisted on looking fantastic while she did so. Lyra was not only significantly taller than Franklin, she was also almost 3 centuries older. She was from a dimension called Verulia, and while Verulians weren't immortal, their average lifespan was about 1,000 years. The men usually only lived to about 850. She was surprised to see Franklin home so early and immediately asked him what the trouble was. He hated that they lived in a house with a staircase immediately in front of the door. She could trap him right there if she wanted to, and he wouldn't have anywhere to run. She stretched out her arms across the narrow hall playfully, trying to cheer him up. Considering what she was wearing, he wished he was in a better mood. He ducked under one of her arms and walked up the stairs into the living room, but he knew he couldn't avoid her forever. Sooner or later, he would have to tell her what happened at Vlachtermat. He took off his shoes, sat on the leather couch, and picked up the remote control. He turned on the black widescreen flat-panel television he rarely watched. He flipped through the channels, certain there wouldn't be anything on at 2 in the afternoon, but hoping for some sort of distraction. Lyra sat beside him. "Really," she said. "What happened? Not another death threat, I hope." "Not exactly," said Franklin. "Let me guess, then. A robot broke into your office, killed a patient, and you stopped it just before it killed you." Franklin sighed. "Yeah, that's about right." "I thought that's what that look meant." Franklin shook his head. "It's not fair. Why do you still get to keep your superpowers?" Being a Verulian, Lyra possessed an uncanny sense of intuition. She couldn't read minds, but she had an amazing understanding of body language and tonal inflections that, combined with a gland in her brain that humans didn't have, allowed her to pick up on things no one else could possibly know. It was like having an extremely advanced hunch, and hers were nearly always right. When Franklin had still been telepathic, it had been a strange role reversal for him. She could almost always tell what he was thinking just by looking at him, and since Verulians weren't susceptible to telepathy, she was the only person close to him whose mind he couldn't read. He had once asked Lyra why he couldn't read her mind, and she had just shrugged and said her species was too awesome to be affected by mental powers. She then claimed Verulians were also immune to high temperatures up to 150 degrees, cat allergies, and the cuteness of babies. It was often impossible to tell when she was joking. Franklin's eyes returned to the television. There was a still picture of a dark green leafy plant sitting in a dull, flesh-colored pot. The image never changed. He wondered if entertainment had degenerated so far that there was actually a whole channel devoted to this. Lyra said, "Don't take it out on me. Nobody gave me my ability." Franklin turned off the TV and slumped on the edge of the couch. "I worked hard for that telepathy. And anyway, that isn't the point." "Isn't it?" Lyra sat closer and put one of his hands in hers. "You think you could have stopped that man from dying if you could still read minds?" I've never lost a patient before." Lyra nodded. "Doctors have to deal with that all the time." "I'm a therapist, not a surgeon. My patients' problems aren't usually so immediately life-threatening." "It wasn't your fault. What kind of robot was it anyway?" "Wait, don't tell me. HR 120. Franklin glared at her. "Sorry." She thought for a moment and then abruptly stood up. "Maybe you should take some time off." He shook his head and continued slumping. "I can't do that." "Why not? You obviously need it. You've got plenty of vacation built up. Just take a week and then I can't take time off because I'm going to quit." He couldn't believe he was saying it out loud. The thought hadn't even crossed his mind until now, and he suddenly realized there were no other options. Despite his hope that he could somehow survive at Vlachtermat without telepathy, he knew he wasn't cut out for it anymore. His job was about more than mere psychology. It was an adventure. It wasn't simply about having a superpower either. William wasn't supernatural, but he had grown up traveling around with his parents to other dimensions. They were both painters, and they had embraced the multiverse for inspiration. They weren't especially good painters, and they barely made enough income to support themselves, but at least William had the benefit of decades of knowledge and experience. Franklin had learned a lot in 5 years, but it wasn't enough. He wondered if William would have known Virginia Stanley was an HR-120 just by looking at her. He vividly remembered the night he last saw Stephen's Arcadium. Franklin was up late, catching up on some paperwork, when the strange, fat man knocked on his office door. Zarkadium had been to see him every week for almost a year, until he was finally stable enough to work through things on his own. They hadn't seen each other for a couple of months. The last time they'd spoken, Zarkadium was putting together his own small landscaping business. He never expected to see Zarkadium again, but it turned out that if he hadn't, he never would have worked at Vlachtermat or met his wife. In 5 minutes, Stephen Zarkadium had opened the portal to Franklin's future. "What can I do for you?" Franklin asked. Zarkadium was grinning from ear to ear, and it made Franklin uncomfortable. This was a man who had once considered electrocuting himself in his own bathtub with a microwave. "I'm here to do something for you," Zarkadium said. "You helped me learn to live in this world after mine had disintegrated into nothingness. I appreciate that, but I was only—" "Don't say you were only doing your job." He paused. Zarkadium had always been a very passionate man. "You have no idea what you did for me. My world literally disintegrated into nothingness." Franklin was concerned. This man was dead serious. "I never told you, because I knew you wouldn't believe me. I usually keep my true origins to myself. It's easier for everyone that way. My world was called Corvadia, and now it's gone." Franklin stood up and pushed his chair into his desk. "So when you said that the sun would never shine again, and that the rivers of your life were drying up, and that the dung beetles had drawn their last breath, you weren't being metaphorical." "That all happened," Zarkadium said. His creepy smile had returned. "And I may never have gotten through it without you. I'm here to give you something for your trouble, Dr. Bryce. You've already compensated me for—" "It wasn't enough," Zarkadium said. "I can give you something that will change your life." He lifted his arms into the air, and a small, swirling purple cloud appeared over their heads. It grew until it had engulfed the ceiling. And all at once, as Franklin looked into Zarkadium's familiar eyes, one gold and the other a hot pinkish color, the idea that Zarkadium might not be from Earth began to make some kind of sense. "I don't know what that is, but I don't think I have room for it in my house," Franklin said. Zarkadium laughed. "Don't worry. This won't hurt." The cloud struck Franklin with a strange bolt of green lightning, and he was surprised to find that Zarkadium was right. It didn't hurt, but it made his head feel like he had been thinking too hard. After a few moments, the cloud began to dissipate, and Franklin was disoriented. He seemed to see 3 of everything for a moment. When everything came back into focus, Zarkadium told him to try and read his mind. Before he even thought about how ridiculous of a request that was, Franklin recited the first 2 full paragraphs of Moby Dick, and he was amazed. Franklin had never read it. "That's your gift," Zarkadium said. "You're about to have the chance to look at people's psyches in a way you never knew was possible. And you're going to meet people, like me, from places you never knew existed. Welcome to the Multiverse." And just as one man had opened that incredible portal of wonder and possibilities for Franklin, Rajal Sharak had closed it. Without his telepathy, Franklin was rock climbing without any gear. He had only ever quit one other therapy job, and he'd done so to work at Vlachtermat. After tomorrow, the only extra-dimensional thing in his life would be Lyra. She tried to talk him out of it, and after an hour of listening to her tell him how talented he was, even without telepathy, about all the people he had helped, like Zarkadium, he still couldn't get past the logic that the patients at Vlachtermat were different from the ones he had seen before he worked there. There was a difference between helping people who thought they were seeing talking trees and people who were actually seeing talking trees. So Franklin resigned from Vlachtermat, and he quickly found work at a smaller office. After only a couple days, he was already missing the resources that had been available to him at Vlachtermat. After all, having the means to send a chronically depressed patient to a pocket dimension had always been quite a time saver. Once they'd spent a day in a dimension made entirely out of bread, home didn't seem so bad. After 2 weeks of normal patients, it would have been easy for Franklin to pretend things were like they had been before Zarkadium. But then he met a woman named Helena Kathryn. She came to see him after screaming at a man at a bus stop that she was a 6-year-old girl who had lost her mother and wanted to go home. She looked about Lyra's age, if Lyra were human, and the only way he could have described her was perfect. Not perfect in the sense that she swept him off his feet at first sight. He wasn't ready to leave his wife and run away with her. She was attractive, to be sure, but she was perfect in that she had absolutely no physical blemishes. Her teeth were bright white and perfectly straight. Her shoulder-length hair, the color of chocolate mousse, was cut perfectly even, and there wasn't a strand out of place. Her face was absolutely symmetrical, and she wore no makeup. There was nothing to cover up, no acne, no moles, not even so much as a freckle. Franklin certainly wasn't accustomed to noticing these sorts of physical details in his patients. It was unprofessional, but Helena looked like she had been sculpted rather than born. She seemed to have associative identity disorder, commonly known as multiple personality disorder, but he had dealt with similar cases in the past in 3 or 4 different species. It wasn't her actions that scared him, it was her name. After his experiences with beings from other dimensions, Franklin had come to realize one of the bizarre constants of the multiverse. No matter what dimension they came from, people with 2 first names were always trouble. And not trouble like saying embarrassing things in public or knocking over shoe stores. They were trouble like stopping the world from spinning, or causing every person who had ever said the word voluptuous to suddenly disappear like they'd never existed. There was no doubt about it. Helena Kathryn was going to be trouble. Franklin shook her hand as she walked into his new office. It was on the ground floor of the building and was quite a bit smaller than his last office. He missed his glass coffee table, his spacious window, and the gorgeous view of the city. His new office had one very small window that looked out into a parking lot, and just enough room for 2 semi-comfortable armchairs, a desk, and a wastebasket. He couldn't even use his old coat rack. Now he had to hang his coat on a hook on the door. "I've been looking for you, Dr. Bryce," said Helena. "Really? I hear you specialize in unusual cases. You were recommended to me by one of the officers who picked me up at the bus stop. He told me he had a sister who came to you after swearing a car tried to eat her." Franklin remembered that patient, a 30-something woman who had a bad run-in with a Farquid, a common pet in the Navwist dimension with the ability to mimic metallic objects. He had an impossible time convincing her that what she had seen was a real creature and that she wasn't actually going insane, despite having just completed a lengthy drug rehab. "What's your problem, Miss Kathryn?" "I have multiple personalities," she replied. Franklin nodded. "The little girl who was bothering the man at the bus station. That wasn't you?" "No, that was Alicia. She's 6 years old and is perpetually lost and frightened." "How long have you had this other personality?" "As long as I can remember," she said, which isn't long at all. "Just a few months ago, I found myself in the middle of a field outside the city. I had no memory, a wallet, a driver's license, and 6 other personalities in my head." Franklin took off his glasses, pulled out a handkerchief from his shirt pocket, and cleaned his lenses. 6? "Yes," said Helena, "and every one of them knows exactly who she is. Everyone except for me." Franklin leaned forward with his pad and pen in hand. Considering her bizarre situation, he found it odd how incredibly calm and patient she seemed. The other multiple personality cases he had encountered were unfocused and lacking in self-confidence. Helena just looked confused. "I wonder if I could meet one of them." "I was hoping you would," Helena said, nodding. "I've always known how to call them. I don't know how I know, but I know." "Which one will I be meeting?" "Tracy. Most people find her obnoxious, but at least she's not insane." "You consider yourself insane?" "No, not me. One of the other personalities. Sandra. She thinks pain and death are hilarious. I try not to let her out if I can help it. People don't share her sense of humor." Franklin wondered what exactly she meant by that. Had she actually killed someone? "No, I suppose they wouldn't. Why don't we keep Sandra waiting for another day?" Helena closed her eyes for several seconds and then opened them again. Her serious expression suddenly became lighter, cheerier. "Tracy?" She jumped up and shook his hand like he was a good friend she hadn't seen in years. Franklin was now convinced that something severely traumatic had happened in Helena's past, and it most likely involved cheerleading. "Oh my God! I've been, so looking forward to meeting you. I gotta say, you look absolutely fab. It must be the hair." "Tracy, I'd like to, being stuck inside someone else's head is so weird. Like, the other day, Helena was at a mall, and I was like, hey, Helena, let me take over so I can shop, because I'm, like, so much better at that than she is. And Tracy, if we could just, well, anyway, I'm just glad she finally decided to come see you. We all knew a shrink was a good idea. Well, all of us except Sandy, of course. God, she is hopeless. She's probably like a cannibal or something, and just like none of us knows it. Tracy, can I speak with Helena again, please? Franklin asked, deciding to make it a personal policy from then on to never accept patients with 2 first names. Yeah, no prob. But I don't know why she always gets to steer this boat. Tracy rolled her eyes, closed them, and after a short time, Helena was calm and collected once again. They seemed like 2 remarkably different women. What do you think? Helena asked. I think I'm going to have to keep you here as an inpatient for a while, said Franklin. That's probably a good idea.